Ladies and gentlemen, please welcome Dr. Mehmet Oz.
Welcome back from lunch, everybody. So there's been a lot of talk recently about the use of data, in particular by social networks, shared in ways that a lot of folks don't think were appropriate, concerns about how they're being used by other governments. But I'm not talking today about private data. We're talking about the individual kind of data, the really personal, really specific kind of material that medical companies can gather, or others, but use them for medical treatments, treating intractable, seemingly intractable ailments. Dr. Robert Califf is an expert in the area of big data, which is the phrase we'll use for this, and he's going to explain how scaling up medical data from the individual to many can make a dramatic change. This is absolutely riveting stuff. Dr. Califf.
Hey, thanks so much. Great to be here. I've really enjoyed the religious discussions. I think that's, for me, has been the highlight. And I don't want to be a downer, but some of what I have to say may not sound so good at first. So I hope you can bring us back up in the Q&A part. So this is my first slide. I just want to make 4 quick points about this, and I'm going to race through the rest so we can get to the Q&A. This is not the election map, contrary to what you may think. This is the difference in life expectancy by county in the United States. There are 4 main points here to make. The first is that while we're talking about longevity, the life expectancy in the good old USA has gone the wrong direction now the last 2 years in a row. And every projection that I've seen is telling me it's going to be worse in this next upcoming year. So while there are many great things, there's something that we're not doing right. Secondly, this is not uniformly distributed. I spent half my time in Durham, North Carolina, a little blue dot in the middle of the state of North Carolina, the other half in San Francisco. Blue here means living longer. Red means living shorter. And you can see a distinct pattern to this, which is quite remarkable, quite associated with other factors. The third point is what's driving the changes now are 3 things that we didn't talk about much today. The first is opioid overdose. The second is suicide. The third is good old cardiometabolic disease. Despite everything we know, we're headed the wrong direction now in metabolic disease. And the fourth point is just the amazing thing that we can measure this now in every country in the world almost continuously because of big data. So we have no excuse for ignoring it. I liked what Francis had to say, that we ignore this at our peril and at the risk of our own social conscience. Now, at the next level, what's driving this, and these are the factors, this is work by Chris Murray's group in Seattle at the Gates Foundation. It's really spectacular work. They do it for the whole world, but they've been focused on the US lately. And what you see here is the big factors in determining life expectancy are how much money you have, how much education you have, where you live, your race, your sex, with women doing better than men substantially. And then very small effect down at the bottom is healthcare delivery. The good news is, as a doctor, it actually came in as a factor, but not by much. The intermediate factors are in the middle: obesity, physical activity, cigarette smoking, hypertension, diabetes. Just plain bread and butter stuff is where we're failing in the US today. And so I would argue that big data and the ubiquity of information and the ability to communicate now on a global basis is a solution to the problem. And at the same time, it's been a part of the problem. And if we don't handle it well in terms of policy and how we deal with things, it could get a lot worse instead of better. And this morning sort of reminded me of this blind man and the elephant that I show everywhere I go now, because you'll notice when scientists are at work or people running companies, you listen to each talk and you would think each one is a cure for everything that's known to mankind. But if you work at a place like the FDA, like I did, you see that most things actually don't work. 90% of drugs that get into phase 1 either have too much toxicity or actually don't have the benefits that were expected. One of the great lessons of the last decade is that men are not mice. And so things that work in mice often don't work in people for a whole variety of reasons. And I would argue one of the big reasons for that is that we haven't been able to look at the whole elephant. We're each looking at one slice of the elephant at the time, when we really need to be able to look at the entire human being, and even better, the entire human being in the context of other people that they're interacting with, because it's the interaction that often drives the outcomes that are important. So to that end, and here I'll just have to say I'm completely conflicted. I started working on this before I went to the FDA. And when I came out, I became the sponsor of the study, and I'm a faculty member at both institutions that are enrolling people in the study called Baseline. But the way to think about Baseline is to think about maps. If I had told you in 2007 that you would get into your car, you'd start talking to your car, and tell it where you wanted to go. Your car would talk back to you and tell you where to go. And as you started driving, based on simultaneous integration of information across the entire US, it would change what it told you to do in real time, which is, of course, something that most of us take for granted now. And the only reason that could happen is because several companies mapped every single road in the US, and through brute force, keep those maps completely up to date. Now, they're not perfect, but they work pretty darn well. And when I listen to people today, I would imagine 80% of the work of the research that we heard about was just developing instruments to collect the data so that people could talk about it. What if we had maps for the human condition? So to that end, we started doing that in the Alphabet group of companies together with some academic institutions. And just to give you an idea of the size of the data that we're ingesting now, it's 6 terabytes of data for every person that participates in the first 2 days. It's just a list of all the things that are measured. Now imagine if you started your research with that information in hand, just like you do with maps. You don't pay every time you get in your car and talk to it. There are other ways it gets paid for. In addition to that, we have this new thing of integrating time. We've been limited up until now by people having to physically come into a clinic to have things measured. Now with things that we can put on people and use with people, we can measure time. And this is just a reminder of how important time is. I've been to the Rolling Stones every decade for the last 4 decades. Mick Jagger's body looks exactly the same over those 4 decades. His face looks a little different, as you can see here. So there is a role for time, and we just could not really even approach that until now, but there is no limitation now on the inclusion of time because there's no limitation in the space that can be used for storing information or the power of computing when you align processors. And it's been a real interesting part of my new life at Alphabet to see that in action. But it's not just the biological. We now, across health systems, can measure things because everything is digital. Every time you touch the system, the information is collected. These health systems all have a business reason to collect information to run their health systems. And to that end, we've been working with a group called PCORNET, funded by the Patient-Centered Outcomes Research Institute, to bring together patient advocacy groups with health systems to create a national research infrastructure in the U.S. And I'm pleased to say that at this point, I'm now chairing the board. I sort of retired from doing the work when I went to FDA, but I was pleased to come back and be able to work with it. We now have information on over 100 million Americans, about a third of the country, with digital information being curated every 3 months, giving us an enormous population. But it doesn't stop with biological or health system data either. In the Baseline study, we're sending everyone home with a watch that measures 17 things, a sleep sensor, a phone that measures multiple attributes of your activity, and all integrated and stored in the cloud. If there's one paper to read out of this, I'd recommend Tom Insel's paper from JAMA last year about digital phenotyping. The idea here is that if you got that information, you can tell a lot about a person without ever having to see them. My favorite word in here is prosody. Prosody refers to the ability to infer things based on the way someone talks, not actually what they say. The cadence of the voice, the speed of the voice can tell you a lot about mood, about cognitive function, about other aspects. And of course, if someone has a tremor, a tremendous amount by combining the cell phone and the watch information that one can infer. But it doesn't stop there either. We are all connected now. Raise your hand if you have not done a search in the last 24 hours. 1, I see 1. All right, so the percentage, I've talked to over 40,000 healthcare professionals since I was FDA commissioner, and I would say it's less than 1% that answers that question, no. So we are all on the internet all the time, and our patients are on the internet the minute they leave the clinic, trying to figure out what the hell we were talking about. So an approach to that that's being used at Google now is to have what's called a knowledge panel, because we like when people to search and then to get information that's useful and accurate, and I think we'd all agree we're far away from that now. And I just put this up here as one element of what I'm going to talk about in a minute, which is truthfulness on the internet. But the power of this potentially is profound. So here's a look at depression. It turns out 10% of people in every society are depressed. That's 300 million people plus around the world. Half of them never get treated around the world. Out of those who do get treated, if you look at search, you'll see that it's an average of 7 years from the time someone's depressed until the time something is done about it. So people are talking to the internet before they're talking to their doctors about this. And treatment, of course, is not completely effective, but it's partially effective. And so we're now beginning to wonder, with this tool that almost everyone in the world is using, are there things that we can do that can truly take care of this problem I showed you, where the rural areas, for example, in the US, are really suffering with life expectancy going the wrong direction. To that end, if you search and you're depressed now, you'll get a pop-up that says, would you like to take a survey? And it's a PHQ-9, which is a medically validated questionnaire for depression. I'm not at liberty to say how many people have filled this out. It's only about 8 months old, but let's just say it's a lot of people. And so now we have to figure out, now that we know there are all these depressed people, and we have a scalable technology, what are we going to do with it? And here's the problem depicted by this slide. Technology has moved forward, people stay the same. And the fact is that we've worried about truthfulness on the internet, I think for a very good reason, and it's recently been a highlight of what we're all concerned about. And I wanted to show you this one piece of documentation from a great study that was just in the journal Science. And what it showed was, if you follow the internet, untruthful statements reach more people faster and last longer than truthful statements. There's something about, the way I like to think about it is, for every question a person has about their health, there'll be an answer on the internet. The problem is that truthful answers have the uncertainties that you're obligated to give as a scientific answer. Untruthful statements resonate with the brain because you're not racked with all the doubt about whether it's right if someone just makes it up. And this is not new. Before the internet, it existed. These are real slides. There actually were snake oil salesmen all over the United States at one point before this was regulated. So when it comes to scalable digital technologies, my main point is it's everywhere. We do need to pay a lot of attention to truthfulness. We can reach everyone, and there's a lot that can be done. Now, this slide is a depiction of the way Google search works as it relates to behavior. 2 quick points here. The first is that everything is looked at all the time because it's possible to do that. The second is, when there's an important question, randomization is used. And I've noticed an aversion to randomization in this meeting. I call it God's gift of randomization, literally. And the way it's talked about at Google is, you would not want to make a business decision without randomization if you weren't sure what was right. It's too important. So why do we take people's health and make guesses instead of getting the answer as to what the best treatment is? And then finally, this slide, which is where we're headed, collective intelligence. And to get there, another noticeable thing to me at this meeting, a lot of individuals talking about their little pockets of data. What if we actually shared our data? We could learn 100 times as quickly. And I would point to cystic fibrosis as an area in medicine where this has happened. And the result has been an increase in life expectancy of 25 years, mostly because of sharing of data. So the conclusion is, I'd been working on this in the 1980s. My very first paper assumed that when people saw a doctor, the doctor would have a computer that would give them the information they needed to give the patient the best advice. I was off by 40 years, but I think it's actually possible to do it now.
Fabulous, succinct, and incredibly powerful. It also raises a lot of questions. Let me go back, we'll go in order of your presentation. You showed us that education, income are much more important drivers of health than healthcare delivery. But how do they co-vary? For example, race does co-vary with, I would think, with financial income. And there are other elements in that chart that probably were linked to those other variables. So if you take those out, and I couldn't read the slide fast enough,
Yeah.
they probably took it into account to a certain extent.
Yeah, I mean, this was actually a multivariable analysis, so it adjusting for other things. And one way to think about it, just adherence to medications is a good example. Cancer chemotherapy, a third of people don't finish it. And it's very closely related to geographic and social factors. So this is mostly about behavior.
And the last question, truth. So much of the data on the web and so much of the data on healthcare is driven by financial elements, not so much did I feel better. So many of the factors you put up there, you'd have to infer if they're doing better by their search habits. Is part of the future of this once in a while ping me and say, did you sleep better last night? Did you lose weight? If you don't know it from a scale.
Absolutely. We're having a lot of fun with this with Baseline, and NIH, Francis Collins has a great study called All of Us. It will have 1 million people doing this. But one of the beauties is they go home with a phone. You can ping them anytime you want, and they can communicate when they want to. The science of how to structure what people say about themselves is a huge evolving area. But I just want to make one point in closing. When we look at these statistics from the U.S., I couldn't imagine a better meeting to think about this than this kind of a meeting, because what's really at the core are a set of behaviors and despair that's occurring where people like our friend from Singularity, who's doing so well and so excited about life and so wealthy and everything going so well, there are a lot of people who aren't experiencing that. The church used to fill a lot of that in the U.S., not so much anymore. So there's a lot to think about here.
Rob, thank you very much. Nicely done.
Thank you.
Appreciate it.